Madam President, I wanted to rise today to talk a little bit about something very obscure that's buried in this budget bill, but something that's very, very important to me. And first, before I talk about the specific policy issues, just wanted to talk about a personal exploration I had, and this is with regard to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in this special area up here called the 1002 area. I had the opportunity in the 1980s to take a raft trip down across this Arctic coastal plain and down to the sea. And part of that reason was many of the Alaska senators at the time used to say, if you're going to make policy in Alaska, you ought to see that part of Alaska. And I took the opportunity to see it and took a raft trip down a river called the Hula Hula River, which flows out of the Brooks Range, a large mountain range, into the Beaufort Sea there. And I can just say from my personal experience, this is one of the wildest, most magnificent places on the earth. And to talk a little bit about the creatures and critters that we saw there, we saw the beginning of the caribou migration, which occurs over in Canada, over to this area in Alaska, where they calve on the 1002 area. It's one of the biggest migrations in the world of a mammal species. We saw grizzly bears. One grizzly bear actually came into our camp, and we had to retreat and watch whatever it was going to do until it moved along. We saw musk oxen, we saw polar bears, and we saw what a marvelous and just incredible area this was, what a rich, rich ecosystem it was. And I was reminded of my Uncle Mo, Congressman Morris Udall, who was the author in 1980 of legislative protections for this area. And he required congressional action to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and in this 1002 area. And he did that because he realized how significant it was and how magnificent it was. And you know, one of the things we have to realize is what we're protecting here. People travel all over the world to go to the Serengeti and see the migrations of the animals on the Serengeti Plain. This migration, this same caribou migration, is very much like the Serengeti. In fact, it is our Serengeti. When you have animals migrate from Canada all the way into Alaska and back. And so this is our Serengeti. It's a special place. It's a real treasure, and I don't have any doubt in my mind that we should save it. Now, Madam President, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge represents one of the world's wildest and most biodiverse places. Its coastal plain, or the 1002 area here, is the biological heart of the refuge. There's no other place like it on the planet. Congress showed remarkable restraint and forethought when it put the refuge under federal protection. And I'm proud that my Uncle Mo Udall was instrumental in passing legislation that doubled the size of the refuge. Under that law, only Congress can open up the 1002 area for drilling. Today, I rise in strong opposition to the Republican proposal to drill for oil in this remarkable place. I will fight their plan tooth and nail, and the only reason they are doing this is to pay for tax cuts for big corporations and tax cuts for the richest Americans. Madam President, the Arctic Wildlife Refuge's coastal plain is an environmental time machine. It is a rare place on this earth where almost everything has been preserved as it was 10,000 years ago. Oil and gas development would change its delicate ecosystem forever. You could never get it back. This refuge is the largest Arctic conservation area on the globe. It's part of our national heritage. It's part of the world's heritage. And that's why I compare it to the Serengeti, where people travel from all over the world to see that migration. The same thing is true here. It would be wrong to plunder this magnificent area for short-term gain, especially when that gain is speculative. The 1002 area is home to 37 species of land mammals, 8 species of marine mammals, 42 fish species, and over 200 species of birds. Migratory birds fly in and out from every state and every continent out of this area. The coastal plain in the refuge is only 20 to 30 miles wide. No other equivalent slice of Alaska's North Slope is as biologically diverse. Here are a few examples of the wildlife that depend on this area. Here's a photograph of a caribou, and it's young during the spring calving time. The 1002 area hosts the largest and most concentrated herd of porcupine caribou in the world. 197,000 caribou make the longest land migration of any animal, 2,700 miles, to give birth there on the coastal plain in the 1002 area. Their numbers are strong now, but even a small change in reproductive rates could threaten the herd's existence. Now here is a picture of a polar bear. 900 Buford sea polar bears den on and offshore in the 1002 area. The magnificent polar bear is threatened under the Endangered Species Act, and with climate change causing sea ice to melt rapidly, more bears are expected to den on shore. And here is a photo of the musk oxen. About 250 musk oxen live there year-round. This impressive mammal survived the last ice age, but forcing them from their habitat now could threaten their survival. And people also depend on the refuge. The Gwich'in have lived there for thousands of years. They call themselves people of the caribou because their culture and way of life are intertwined with the porcupine caribou herd. Caribou represents about 80% of the Gwich'in people's diet. They use caribou skins for clothing, bedding, and shelter. They make fish hooks, skin scrapers, and other tools from caribou bones. The Gwich'in are spiritually tied to the caribou as well. And they have a saying that, quote, every caribou has a bit of human heart in them, and every human has a bit of caribou heart. The Gwich'in people depend on the caribou for their material and spiritual survival. And oil development in caribou calving grounds would threaten their very future. The Republicans' budget resolution instructs the Senate Energy Committee to identify at least $1 billion in deficit savings over the next 10 years. The Republicans have their sights on the 1002 area to produce that $1 billion. As I said, this estimate is highly speculative. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that the number, $1 billion, is correct. It still doesn't even scratch the surface of the $1.5 trillion deficit the Republicans recklessly propose. It's not even 1/1000th of the money the Republicans need to raise to pay for the mega deficit they will rack up to pay for a tax break for the super wealthy. Opening the Arctic Refuge is not necessary for U.S. energy independence. We are now an oil exporter, and oil prices are low. Low prices are forcing companies to stop drilling in areas that are much more accessible and less sensitive to development. Opening the refuge now makes even less sense, and more people are demanding when people are demanding more fuel-efficient and electric cars. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is one of the last truly wild places in America. The decision to protect the refuge from drilling was done carefully and thoughtfully. The decision to undo that protection should be given the same care and thought. But we haven't held hearings. We haven't even been able to hear and question experts. Directing the Energy Committee to draft legislation to raise funds without a public process is premature. The American people will have to live with our decision. This rushed proposal shortchanges them, and it shortchanges future generations. Mr. President, there are few places left in the world where the Arctic coastal plains, foothills, and mountains and the wildlife they support are wild and free. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is one of those places. This unique, grand, and biologically rich place deserves full protection in perpetuity. Mr. President, I yield the floor.